Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. So in this one, we're going to be looking at static and media folders. So I'm going to give you an overview on how to set up static and media inside of your Django application. And then we're going to configure AWS S3, the simple storage solution from Amazon. And we're going to have our static and media files being served from the AWS service. So we'll create a small app, an upload image application. We'll do that very quickly. You can skip over that if you want to, and then head into the AWS setup. But I will go through an overview of how to use and implement static and media folders inside of your Django application before then moving across to configuring AWS to serve those files from the S3 service. So in addition to that, we'll have a look at, or at least I'll brief you on ACLs, the access control lists, and also setting up policies based upon groups and users. So by the end of this tutorial, you will have a baseline of knowledge of how to set up your Django application with S3, but you ought to go then and move that forward and just do some more reading. And before you start implementing this into a production environment, you want to really grasp the idea of the securities that are in place to protect your files, because once you start allowing users to upload files to a server, then you've got potential security problems. This tutorial is split into two parts. In the first part of the tutorial, I'm just going to go through, for those who need it, how to set up the media and static files within Django. So I'll create a small project very quickly and we'll set up the media and static folder for those files. So once we've done that, we'll then migrate our media and static files over to AWS. So if you're already comfortable with media and static files and you just want the AWS part, then just use the timeline in the description and just skip ahead to the AWS start. So here in Django, we have two repositories. We have the static files or static folder and the media folder. So the difference being that the static folder, typically we're going to use that for files that our project is dependent upon. So JavaScript files, CSS files, other code files that our website potentially requires. So having that folder separate from the media folder means that we can apply different security privileges and manage it differently from the media folder. So the media folder tends to be a folder or an area which we can allow users to upload images potentially, or where media for our project will reside. So this typically has different permissions because we want to allow users to actually upload and potentially interact with that space. So first of all, we're going to set up the static folder and the media folder here in this development environment. So I've gone ahead and built this simple Django project. The project's called Core, and I've made a new application called Demo. So first of all, we're just going to set up a very simple file upload system and then handle those files that are uploaded using the media folder. So because we're using media, we're going to pip install pillow. And then we're going to need somewhere to actually store the media folder. Or sorry, store the media files. So I'll create a new folder. I'm just going to call that media. Of course, you can change these folders to absolutely anything you want. In reality, I'm just going to call this one media. So I'm just going to build a very simple interface in my demo app, which is going to allow users to actually upload files, so we can simulate the uploading of files and then storing within the media folder. So that we can see the media folder in action, we've gone ahead into the demo app in the models, and we've just created a very simple model here. So just to give you some detail on this, if you look at the post table, you can see that we have the image field. So we're going to upload an image and then just define the upload path. So here we're using this new method, or connecting the upload to any method called user directory path. We take in the instance and the file name. So the instance allows us then to utilize other items. So for example, here we're taking in the instance ID, which doesn't actually work. I just wanted to point out that we could actually, for example, here type in, for example, user ID. So we could capture the user ID and utilize that as part of the actual link to where the image is going to be saved. So here what we're trying to do is to format the actual path of the image. So inside of media, we're going to create a new folder called posts, and then we potentially want to use some sort of identification. So here, for example, like I said, we could potentially use the user ID so that we can then identify that folder to a user. And then the last item here, we have the file name. So this link ends up being media/post/the user ID and then the file name. You can alternatively just select or define a default path right here if you wanted to. So I've gone ahead and created a form here. This is just going to be the form that we're going to utilize to allow users to upload the images. So we're just taking in the title, the image caption, and the image, which is going to be the actual image upload facility here in this form. I've added a few different items here. So these are just bootstrap items. So then we head over to the view. So we're going to take in the upload form and we're going to use a form view here. So we take in the template, which we're just about to build. Obviously the form class is upload. That's the form. And then we have the success URL, which is just going to be the same page. So it's just going to link you to the same page. So we validate the form, we save the form, and then we print the form clean data. And that's just going to print to the console if you're not familiar with printing. And that's about it really in the view. So let's go ahead and just configure our URLs. So here we have the upload. So here we're just linking to our upload view. Remember we're using class-based views here. So as view, and then give it the name upload. The app name is demo. So that's in our demo application. Obviously now in the core, I need to link to that URL. So let's just get rid of all that. So I add the link to the demo URLs, and then I just need to also include right there. So that's the URLs in place. And then just finally, we need to add the template. So go ahead in the demo, I'm going to add a new folder called templates. And then inside of here, I'm just going to drop in a new file called index. So on this page, we've just created some bootstrap code here, and I've just added the form. So the form is right here, and we're just adding the form here. So I am using a base here. So in addition to that, I've also just built a very simple base. So this is just a bootstrap implementation here. Just change the title. So you can see that we are extending from the base. Okay, so with that in place, let's just check the server and refresh our page. And you can see this is what we have, a very simple upload form. So we just need to type in the title and maybe the name of the caption and then choose a file and then upload. So this is an example of using media folder. So now we need to actually configure the media folder. So let's remember that we're working in a development environment here. The configuration for a production server would be slightly different. So just to note that we are using a development environment. So to get the media started or working, go over to the core and in the settings. At the bottom here, we just need to add some additional configuration. So what we're trying to do here is just tell Django where all the resources are. So in our settings here, we've got two settings that we can configure for our media route. And these are the two settings here. So we've got the media URL and then also the media route. Okay, so let's go ahead and now we've configured that. There's an additional configuration that we need to do. So we are using OS because we're trying to create a media route with a path, the base directory of our application and the folder media. So let's go up here and also just import OS. We're going to need that. So those are the 2 points that we need to create here in the settings file. So here we have 2 settings. Just to cover this quickly then, so we have the media root, which is an absolute path, so the OS path, the base directory, then the media, so that's going to create an absolute path to our media folder. And then we have the media URL, because obviously when we serve our web page, it's not going to be utilizing the absolute path for our media root. It's going to be potentially utilizing the URL. So here we have 2 settings that we configure. So now we have that in place. For a development server, we have an additional configuration. If you go over to the URLs, we're going to need to add into here an additional configuration. So let's go ahead and import. So we're going to need to import settings, and we'll just set this up for static as well. So we only have to come here once. So we can do a bit of that. And then what we need to do is then just define. So I've created this bit of code here. Now we just defined, this is obviously just for development only. So if settings.debug, so settings being the settings file and the configuration debug being true. So if the debug is true, you can see here that we've set up some URL patterns for the static URL and the media URL. So here we're just trying to simulate a production server URL essentially that we can utilize within our own development environment. So that needs to be in place. So you can see that I've done it for the static files, which we'll cover shortly, and the media folder. If you wanted to read these, you just need to notice that again we're using settings media URL. So we import settings here, and then we want to utilize media URL, which is obviously a reference point in the settings to this media URL right here. Okay, so now we have that in place. Let's go ahead and just make sure the server's on. Okay, so I've gone ahead and chose a file and include the title, so press upload. You can remember that in the view, I've just made it so it loops back to this page. So it looks like it's worked. So let's go back into the code here. So what we should have now in the media is a folder here called post and then none. So the reason why it says none is, like I was telling you earlier, that this is just to give you an idea of how you can utilize this instance here. Because there isn't an actual ID in this post, then it's going to return none. So you can see that I've uploaded some files here. So every time it's uploaded, it's utilized the file name. And notice that when you upload a file with a similar name, Django automatically puts a random string on the end of the file name. So you do end up with files or similar files, but with just different names. So it might be that you would configure to check to make sure that if an image exists, it overwrites, depending obviously how you want this set up. So there's a quick overview on how to set up the media folder. So now let's think about the static files. So it's the same type of process really. Here I'm just going to create a new folder called static. For this example, I've just created a simple static CSS file here, just with some simple CSS. So let's have a look at how we can actually connect our static files to the templates. So if you go over to the templates in demo, in the index here, or potentially the base. So what we want to do is we want to import our CSS into our project. So you can see here that first of all, what we need to do when we want to include static files is to actually load them in. So load static. So that needs to be on each page that we want static files. And then you can see here we reference static in this href to link to this CSS style sheet. And then we just define the actual file we need. And obviously this is a file path right here. So if you had a folder structure inside of your static folder, you could apply that right there. So to get this static files to work, we need to go back into now the core. And at the bottom here, similar to what we've done with the media, we also need to now set up the configuration for our static files. So in Windows, we have 3 potential settings here: static root, static URL, and the static files directory. So this is obviously the absolute path for the static files. We have the URL and additionally the root. So the static root, this is going to be helpful and utilized for when we utilize the collect static command. Before we place our application into a production environment, we would typically run collect static command. So Django looks for all the static files in our apps and it collects them all and then puts them into the static root. So let's go ahead and just run the collect static command. So collect static, you'll see that there will be a problem because we haven't actually defined our static root yet. So let's just go ahead and define static root and then try that again. And now you can see that we have 133 static files copied to static. Now notice here where it's actually stored, the C drive as static. So that isn't obviously what we want here. So you can see what's happening there. So we'll configure this later. Let's move on to the next step. So now we've configured the static here. We should now go back to our web page and we can refresh. And you can now see that it's picked up our CSS file and is actually utilizing our static files. So that was a brief introduction to using the media folder and static files within Django. Let's remember this is just a development environment. So as I keep saying, you would configure this differently if you're using a production server. So now that we have an example application that we've just built, let's now go ahead and configure our application to serve the media and static folder from AWS. So go ahead and sign up and I'll see you inside of AWS. So just a quick note for those who haven't used AWS before, you notice that when you log in, you've got two options, a root user and IAM user. So here we have the potential capacity to create additional users, but also think of this as the application as a user. So we can define very specific control and security over our applications based upon what resources we want them to access. So we'll have a look at that later in this tutorial, but you ought to use the root user to begin with if you've just signed up to login. Okay, so welcome to AWS, the management console. So from the management console, you can't see this on mine because I've just hidden my username, but if you go over to services, you can then type in S3. This should bring up the scalable storage in the cloud. So we're going to use the S3 service to store our media and static files and have Amazon or the AWS service serve our media and static files to our Django project. And this can be done in a development environment. So let's go ahead and set up S3. So we can see here that we are going to create a new bucket. So let's go ahead and create a new bucket. So I'm just going to call my bucket Django demo. And you can select your region and so on. And then from this example, we want to just deselect blocked or public access. Okay. And then we don't need anything else. We're just going to set up a basic baseline configuration, and you can then go and explore the different options. It already exists. Okay. Apologies, I acknowledge that. Okay, so now we have this new storage point where we can now potentially access our media and static folder. So AWS provides a service called IAM. So it allows us to set up other users, essentially, which we can then assign to individual projects. So by doing this, we can micromanage these users based upon the access that they're required, based upon the applications that they're associated to. So instead of having one admin user, which we then utilize to access our applications or access AWS through our applications. We're going to set up individual users, and we can then apply individual security to those users, which can then be utilized individually for individual applications, thus providing better security to our AWS service. So if you go over to services, apologies if that didn't make sense. I kind of embellished there a little bit. And let's just type in IAM. So we've got the management services. So essentially, we're just going to make a new user, which we're then going to utilize within our application to connect to our S3 bucket. So here you can see that I've already got a user and a group. So let's just go ahead and create a new group. I'm going to call this S3 demo group. So let's just create the new group. Sorry, S3 demo. Got ahead of myself then. So next step. And then we're going to give this a policy. The AWS S3. So we're going to give them a policy. This is a policy. So this is a security control script. So here's going to define what access this group can have to the, in this case, Amazon S3. So here is a default access policy called Amazon S3 full access. So I want to give the users full access because I need to upload files and I need to download files. So users are going to need to be able to upload their files to S3 bucket, our Amazon bucket here. So we're going to need full access to begin with. So let's just press next and then create group. Okay, so now we've got this group here called S3 demo. We can now make a user and apply it to that group. So let's just go ahead and create a new user. So I'm going to call this user S3 demo. So we're going to need programmatic access. So this is the setting that we want because we're essentially needing an access ID key. We're going to need to use that to configure our Django application to access our AWS service. So I select the programmatic access, and press next. And then I want to add them to a group. So the S3 demo group, remember that has Amazon S3 full access to our folder that we created earlier. So press next. And here we're just going to press next. Okay, so this is the setup. We've made a group. We've now made a user and put them in that group. Remember that the group has a policy set. So the security policy to S3, not the user. Okay, so we create user. And there we go. So now we have an access key ID and a secret key. So you can go ahead and download that. We'll utilize that shortly. So that's going to provide us access to that folder. So at this point, I just want to note that this demonstration is just for demonstration purposes only and for you to get a grasp and an understanding about some of the AWS technologies and settings that you could apply in your application. This is by no means a robust production setting. I'm assuming that you're new to AWS, you've never used AWS before. I'm just introducing you to the service and some of the features that it offers. So now that we've configured the AWS service, or at least allowed access, or we should be able to now access our bucket, we now need to configure Django with a few different packages and then a little bit of configuration. So let's go ahead now and actually install the two packages that we're going to need for this. So the first package that you're going to need to install is Boto 3, which is the AWS SDK for Python. So is the Amazon Web Service Software Development Kit. This is going to allow us the services and tools to actually create the connection and upload, etc. And then just to make the process easy for us to implement, we're also going to be installing Django storages. So like it says, there's a collection of custom storage backends for Django. So we're just building upon Boto just to make things a lot easier for us to configure without having to actually create our own packages to actually utilize the S3 storage in any way. This should make the process a whole lot easier. So I'll go ahead and pip install the Boto 3 tools. And then we will also install Django storages. So go ahead and pip install Django storages. Okay, so now we have all the packages that we're going to need. We can now head back into the core and our settings. This is what we need to do next. Okay, so I've gone ahead and now configured the settings needed. So let's have a quick look at these. So you can see that we've got AWS Access Key ID, which is the ID, key ID that I downloaded. Remember when we created the access, we had some new user credentials, and I downloaded the file for that, so the new user file. So this is what it looked like. We had the username, the access key, and then the secret key, and then the console login link. So I use these details here to configure the access key and then the secret access key. So my storage bucket was called Django Demo 1234. So we can just double check that. So that was the name of my bucket. And finally, we then go down here. So this is just some setup configurations, and we have the AWS default ACL. So I'm going to set this to public read. So Amazon provides us with some default ACL, so access control lists. So here is defined as public read. Now I think by default, if we don't include this setting, the default ACL will be private, which will mean that when you upload the files, they will only be accessible for a short amount of time, and then you won't be able to access them through your system. So public read is going to provide us essentially a method of being able to read the files, but not actually potentially write to those files or folder. So that gives you an idea of why we're utilizing ACL. So if we head over to a page here, this is going to be well worth a read on this page, the access control list overview. Have a look through here and get an idea. So we're using the canned ACLs. So there's a number of different options here. Just have a read through. And this is where it starts to become a little bit overbearing. Potentially if you're new developers just wanting to get a website out there, AWS can be a little bit of a monster to begin with until you start learning a little bit more about it. Now, it is always recommended, I always recommend for new developers to, before you start using AWS and storage online, because it is quite dangerous to have a folder open for users to be able to upload to. So you kind of need to know what you're doing before you set out this in a production environment. So potentially utilizing hosting first, which managed hosting before you start utilizing these type of systems may be more recommended. But it's definitely worth reading through, like I said, this and many more pages of different settings that you can apply. Okay, so let's get back to this configuration. So you can see that we set to public read, so you can read about what that actually applies. But it is, like it says, allows the public to just read and not write potentially. So we then have the AWS location. So we're going to set this up for static to begin with. And then we define the static files directory, which is going to be the OS path join of the base directory and the static. So again, that's just our absolute path to the static folder that we created earlier, which was somewhere around in our project. Okay, just here. Okay, so nothing ever goes smooth. So I've gone ahead and used the configuration. Now, just to start off with, I've configured the AWS default ACL as none. So I did show you read only. So I'm just going to start off with none so that we can start from a baseline here. And then I've gone ahead and in the console, you can see I've typed in manage pi collect static. So Django is now going to collect all the static where it now would normally put it into the static folder in our project. It now has uploaded to our AWS service. Now notice that there's 133 static files copied. So what that represents is a lot of the background CSS and JavaScript needed for the Django admin area. So that's what those static files typically represent. So if we now go back into our AWS project, you notice that I made a new bucket in actual fact here. I had to stop and do something, and I've come back at a different time and I created a new bucket. So it was the same process like I've shown you. Now, if you do have a problem whereby you go through the process and it says access is denied, you don't have access to upload files, just go ahead and just delete the bucket and just go through that process again. That's all that you need to do. I promise that's the case. So you can see we've uploaded to our bucket here the static folder. Inside of here, we have the core like we did in our project. And like I said, the admin folder, this is going to have all the CSS fonts, image, and JavaScript for your admin area when you type in the URL/admin. Okay, so now if you head over to the small app that we built, we should now be able to refresh once we start this server, of course. And then we should see that the Amazon is actually providing us our file. So let's go to view page source. You can see here that we're actually being served the CSS page right here. You can see straight away though that we have access denied. So this is a problem that might occur. Notice that I used the AWS default access none. So just reading through the documentation, I think there's been a few changes in how these packages serve the files. So if you want to, first of all, complete it with the ACL as the default, then this is the problem that is going to occur. I believe it utilizes the private feature or the private ACL, which is going to make the file available shortly, but then will make the file private. So the files do get uploaded, but you won't be able to access them. So you'll need to go through this process. If you go to the management, your bucket, so just delete your files. Go ahead and go to the actions and delete, and then just run through the process again, because you'll notice if you use the public read ACL, that will then apply the public read ACL to the files. And then if you go ahead and like I've just done here and collect stats again and just have those files copied across, you'll then be able to go into your project, and as you can see, it's now being served. So if we go back into the view page source and then head over to the link, you can see we can now actually access the files. So you can see here the key to accessing, or the key to protecting your files, is going to be reading those access control lists that I linked to previously in the tutorial. At least that's going to be one step of a successful, secure environment. So here, to generalize, we have two different securities. We have folder and file security, and we have the actual user, that obviously the user that we created earlier, which is utilized to create an API to actually connect our application to our service. Now, if you remember, if you go back into the IAM service, we created a user and we gave it, we inserted it or included it into the group, and that group had policy. That group had a policy, the S3 policy, which was the full access. Now, we don't necessarily want our application to have full access to our buckets. So that might mean creating new buckets, etc. We know that Django should only have access to a very specific bucket that we created, and potentially then specific folders within that bucket. In this case, they should only have access, or the application should only have access to the static folder and the media folder that we're going to create. So let me just give you an example of how to make a custom policy for our user. So inside of the IAM service here, we have policies, and it gives us the opportunity to create a new policy. You can see that I've already created one. So go ahead and select that, and then you can just select the JSON. So if you know what you're doing, you can just apply this. But if you explore the visual editor, that gives you more of a GUI interface, and you can look at all the different options that are available to create your different policies. So here's an example of something that you might want to set up. So we know that we only want this program or this user to, or the group, to access certain folders, like I said. So here we've set up an action. So it allows them to access the S3 services, but then we define what resources they have access to. So they have access to the root. This is the actual bucket name. In my case, I've changed the bucket name. So this is my bucket that I want this user or group to access only. And obviously I want them to be able to access all the other folders and files in there. So this is a simple overview, an example of how you might want to then further apply security to the user or group to only access certain resources in the S3 service. So we can review the policy here, and then we can give it a name. We call that S3 Django demo. And there we go. So let's just create that policy. Now, of course, we want to apply that policy to a group in this case. So let's go over to the groups, and then we've got permissions here, and you can see that we've got this attached policy. So let's just, this is interesting, the simulate policy. You can actually check policies against different rules, etc. That'd be worth exploring, but we can go ahead and attach a policy. So we called that S3 Django demo. Now, I think it was this one I created. So attach that one. So we can now obviously detach this policy here. So they only have access now, this user, or the users in this group should only have access now to those folders. So that should now be in place. So let's just test that out in our application. And it still seems to be working. So it looks like everything is still okay. Now you could obviously go ahead, and if you made a new bucket, you could try and utilize this user to access that bucket. And of course that shouldn't work. So that would be a way of testing this policy, but that just gives you an overview of policies that you can apply to a user to further enhance the security in your application or the S3 environment. So next up, we want to obviously move ahead slightly and also apply the same settings for our media. So we're now going to set up a custom folder to utilize for the media. So we're going to set up some custom settings. So in the core, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this storages. So we're going to set up a custom storage for our media. So you can see here I've imported the S3 Botos 3 storage, and then created a new class here called media store. And then I've set some parameters here. So the location, which is going to be a folder in the S3 bucket called media, and then I've got file overwrite of false. So this is just an additional option that you might want to choose for this type of media. So do you want the users to be able to overwrite other people's files, for example, if they had the same file name? So that's just something for you to think about. So now you can head back into the settings of your core, and here we set the default file storage. And that's going to be core storages media store. So the core storages media store. So that's what we've just set up. Okay, so if you go back into the application, so here I've uploaded, or I've selected an image called Django PNG. I give it a title, I press upload. Of course, not forgetting to start the server first and then press upload. So hopefully what's happened now, if we head over back to our AWS S3 bucket, we should have a new folder called media. And the file that I've just uploaded was going to be in posts. Remember, after post is none because I haven't configured that properly. And then we have the folder, or sorry, the file that I've just uploaded. So you can see that our media folder is now also going to be served from AWS. Okay, so there we have it. That was a short introduction to AWS, or utilizing Django with static and media folders, and also utilizing the AWS service to serve those files to your project. So probably like all tutorials here on this channel, there probably ought to be a follow-up to this. Maybe we can explore some of the more specifics of setting up a production environment for these folders. That's something that we could look at, or we could explore a little bit more about policies and access control lists, etc. I'm happy to take suggestions on what you would like to know and to learn. Hopefully there was something here that you've learnt, and you can now go and apply that in your application, or at least test in your development environments.